freedom fighters, freedom lovers, and those who just want stuff for free. Greetings and hello. It is I, your favorite obscure social studies teacher, with just enough expertise to make things interesting, Mr. Palumbo, and this is the Professor Liberty Podcast. Thanks for tuning in, folks. You know I always appreciate it. If you'd like to email the show, the email is professorliberty1776@gmail.com. That's professorliberty1776@gmail.com. One more time for those of you in the back on your phones not paying attention, that's professorliberty1776@gmail.com. Well, it's winter break. Well, I guess it's the end of winter break here. And, I was thinking about the podcast universe, all you Liberty fans out there, the faceless masses, the tens and tens of people that listen to the show. And I was thinking about you, and I wanted to get an episode in before I run out of time and or energy. You know, in U.S. history, we're finishing up the end of World War II, and we talked a lot about dropping the bomb on Japan. And we talked a little bit about President Truman and his involvement with the whole affair. And so I thought, why not do an episode on President Harry Truman? Here are some fun facts about President Truman. For example, did you know President Truman is the only president to have seen combat in World War I? Did you know that President Truman is the only president of the 20th century not to have a college education? See, boys and girls, when mom and dad push college on you, you can say, well, Harry Truman didn't have a college degree and he became president of the United States. And finally, did you know that Harry S. Truman, the S in Harry S. Truman, stands for nothing? The S does not go with anything. It is literally just an S. This kind of reminds me of Ulysses S. Grant, who also has an S in his name, who also was president, and who also, the S doesn't mean anything. Boy, that's a strange historical factoid right there. Anyway, like I said, during class we discussed a lot about the atomic bomb and the implications for using the bomb. And of course, Harry Truman is a key component to the whole equation. But we'll get to that a little later. As I said a few seconds ago, Harry Truman came from very modest beginnings. And he shares a lot with Ulysses S. Grant in the fact that they both have that weird S that means nothing. But both men lived very obscure lives into their late 40s. And both were poor businessmen. And yet both men seemingly had destiny thrust upon them. Unlike most presidents who come from the wealthy elite, Truman wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He grew up on a farm in Lamar, Missouri in 1884. Life revolved around chores, hard work, and the changing seasons. But Harry Truman was a curious kid. He loved reading history books and soaking up stories of the past. He especially liked studying past presidents, ironically. Truman's political career didn't begin until he was into his 40s, and for all intents and purposes, that career would have never happened without a man named Tom Pendergast. Tom Pendergast was the boss of a powerful political machine in Kansas City, Missouri. He helped launch Truman's political career by recruiting him into the local offices in the 1920s. Pendergast's machine likely used underhanded tactics, including voter fraud, to secure victories. Truman, though not spotless, wasn't directly involved in the machine's corrupt activities. He gained valuable political experience and a reputation for efficiency while working within Pendergast's machines. Historians debate whether Truman truly distanced himself from the machine's shady practices. Needless to say, Truman's relationship with Pendergast is complex, and it is one shrouded in mystery. However, with Pendergast's help, Truman served as county judge and later secured a seat in the U.S. Senate in 1934. Truman's nickname was the Senator from Pendergast, which I'm sure he did not appreciate. By the mid-1930s, however, Pendergast faced federal charges and was eventually convicted of tax evasion. This downfall likely helped Truman further separate himself from Pendergast and his corrupt political machine. During World War II, Truman rose to national prominence as the head of the Senate committee investigating wartime waste. His tenacity and commitment to fiscal responsibility earned him the nickname Give 'em Hell Harry. Politically, Truman was a New Deal Democrat. Truman was a strong believer in the New Deal programs implemented by his predecessor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He believed in using government intervention to regulate the economy, provide social safety nets, and promote equality of opportunity. Truman was also a pragmatist. Being a former businessman and senator from Missouri and a man from humble beginnings, Truman was known for his down-to-earth approach to governing. He believed in finding practical solutions to problems, even if it meant compromising on ideological purity. Some of my favorite quotes of Harry Truman illustrate his pragmatism. For example, he once said, quote, "It is amazing what you can get accomplished if you don't care who gets the credit," unquote. And probably his most famous line, quote, "The buck stops here," unquote, meaning, as president, the responsibility ultimately rests on him alone. Any one of those quotes from a president today would be like a cold drink of water. Imagine having a president that did not make excuses and made decisions and defended those decisions. That's what leadership is, boys and girls. Truman's pragmatism can also be seen in his fiscal conservatism as both a senator and president. As senator, Truman championed a balanced budget and criticized wasteful government spending. He earned a reputation for being a fiscal watchdog, a quality that appealed to many voters wary of the unchecked government spending. As president, he faced many challenges that are going to put pressure on his fiscal conservatism, including the post-war economic needs and the Korean War. However, his fiscal constraint was not absolute, and he maintained high tax rates despite pressure for cuts, believing that this was necessary to pay down national debt and prevent inflation. President Truman was also one of the first presidents in the 20th century to deal with civil rights head-on. Despite his personal bias he may have fostered growing up in the South in the early 1900s, Truman took significant steps towards racial equality during his presidency. One such example is the desegregation orders. In 1948, he issued Executive Order 9980 and 9981. This desegregated the federal workforce and the military, a landmark decision. Many scholars argue that this one decision alone, integrating the military, had a profound impact on the civil rights movement in the decades to come. Truman also established the Civil Rights Commission in 1946, another first step towards addressing the racial inequalities found in America. As we've already briefly discussed, Truman was at the center of the question regarding the end of World War II and using nuclear weapons to achieve that end. Staying faithful to his "buck stops here" mantra, Truman never publicly stated any regret for authorizing the drop of nuclear bombs on Japan. He believed using the bombs would, 1, end the war quickly, and 2, save American lives. However, in personal correspondence, Truman did seem to regret the fact that so many innocent people, especially women and children, had to pay a price for what he described as the Japanese government's, quote, pig-headedness. Being a president who integrates the military, thus giving civil rights a much-needed boost, and also being the president who ends World War II by using nuclear weapons is quite the bill. I mean, if we stopped there, Harry Truman is going to be discussed in historical terms for decades to come. However, Harry Truman didn't stop there. President Truman is also the first president of the Cold War. Being a product of the American democratic tradition, Truman fundamentally disagreed with communism and its ideology. He saw communism as a totalitarian system that suppressed individual liberties and economic freedom, which, in this case, Truman is absolutely correct for all you 20-something college liberal arts folks. Communism is terrible. But I digress. Faced with the quick evaporation of the Soviet alliance after World War II, Truman adopted a policy of containment. This involved providing economic and military aid to countries threatened by communist expansion, as exemplified in the Truman Doctrine. What's the Truman Doctrine? I'm glad you asked. The Truman Doctrine, issued in 1947, was a policy, as I just mentioned, aimed at stopping Soviet expansion. Greece and Turkey were the first two recipients of this aid provided by the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan was also a key component to this doctrine in the early years of the Cold War. Truman's primary goal wasn't to overthrow communist governments, but to prevent their further expansion, hence the term containment. He wasn't always keen on directly intervening in the internal affairs of other countries. Now, different presidents are going to take different approaches to that as the decades roll on. Truman's policies laid the groundwork for the Cold War. And while containment ultimately led to the Soviet Union's collapse, it also resulted in an arms race, proxy wars, and global tensions. However, all of Truman's predecessors worked within the Truman Doctrine to one degree or another until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, which most historians put as December 25th, 1991. Finally, no discussion of Harry Truman, especially Truman in the Cold War, can end unless we talk about his firing of the widely popular and charismatic General Douglas MacArthur. I think the friction between these two show the Constitution working. As here's what I'm saying. The Constitution was set up for civilian control over the military. Any student of history knows why this is the case. For important examples, see Julius Caesar or Napoleon Bonaparte. Examples of how generals have often used their soldiers and their popularity to take over the government and become dictator. Anyway, it seems that the flamboyant and self-assured Douglas MacArthur, who was used to an unusual amounts of autonomy, especially during the war, and the down-to-earth pragmatism of Harry Truman was like oil and water mixing. After World War II, MacArthur became the supreme commander of Allied forces in Japan, overseeing the occupation and the democratization of Japan. Truman, as president, favored a more collaborative approach to policy decisions involving Japan. MacArthur, being who he is, thought of a more unilateral approach. It seems that Truman, not wanting to have any more friction with the Soviets, wanted to allow Soviets to have some input in how Japan was going to look in the future. Boy, I'm glad we didn't go that direction. And it also seems that Truman wanted slower reforms where MacArthur pushed for swifter reforms. And these disagreements are going to highlight the two personalities and the friction moving forward. It also isn't going to help with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. Though it initially brought the two together, MacArthur leading UN forces, he's going to successfully push North Korean troops back to the 38th parallel. However, once MacArthur is determined to win at all costs, a la World War II, complete surrender, MacArthur starts talking about using nuclear weapons. Truman is going to really try to hold the horses here, fearing a wider war with China. Obviously, he disapproved of this escalation. Things finally came to a head when MacArthur publicly challenged Truman's decisions through press conferences and letters, and this insubordination left Truman no choice. In a dramatic move in 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of his command. This decision, though controversial, probably prevented a wider conflict with China. Harry S. Truman died on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88. He passed away in a hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. Overall, Harry Truman was a consequential president. I mean, so many things, so many historical events happened under his watch that it's hard to ignore. And it makes you really ponder, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the need for good men to be in that office, because things happen around the world. We need cognizant, sorry, something was in my throat. We need competent, cognizant, intelligent men of ethics, men of morals, men of value. They have to have values, because you don't know what is going to happen under their watch. Truman once quoted as saying, "All the weight of the planets has fallen on me." Like other presidents, his legacy is mixed with success and failures, but his decisive leadership and his commitment to American ideas helped end World War II and helped set a solid foundation for how America was going to deal with communist expansion during the Cold War era. Some scholars criticize the human cost of his foreign policy decisions. Others criticize his limitations on domestic reforms. All I know is that we'd love to have a man like Harry Truman leading the country today. We would pay an arm and a leg for a guy like that today. Unfortunately, men like that are fewer and far between. Here at Professor Liberty, we seek to educate, inspire, and restore. If you like this podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts and give me a 5-star rating. You can also go to teacherspayteachers.com and look at activities and worksheets and lessons that I have developed that you can use in your homeschooling or your classroom. You can connect with me on Facebook Messenger. I'm also on Twitter, also known as X. Or you can email me at professorliberty1776@gmail.com. Until next time, go throughout the land and proclaim liberty.